And that's why some part of me knows that Jay Powell and all the other policy makers at the Federal Reserve, some of them probably know that they're committing the mother of all policy errors by keeping higher for longer inside recession. Forget about headed into recession. We've already seen too many revisions to play semantics and play word games. We're in recession. Right now, I think that what the Fed is getting right has to do with what it's getting wrong on purpose. So I speak kind of cryptically on purpose. The bank is clearly more focused than it's ever been, maybe since the financial crisis. And I've been looking back at that history when Timothy Geithner was being called up in front of Congress back in 2009, 2010, in the aftermath of the crisis, from when he had been the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And way back then, they were contemplating, shadow banking system that was maybe $10 trillion, $12 trillion in the United States. And here we sit today contemplating a non-banking sector globally that's somewhere in the neighborhood of $240 trillion. And once again, we're struggling with the fact that that's bigger than what we call the conventional banking system, the banking system that is visible to us, which is about $180 trillion in scope. And so with that as a background, I think that the Federal Reserve is rightly focused today on regulating the shadow banking system because it's bigger and it has more power than the conventional banking system has, even though the two really do work hand in hand and benefit and profit from one another. In order for the Fed to focus on regulating all of the financial transactions that are going on in the shadows, they almost have to ignore what's going on in the real economy today. Does that make it right? No, but at the core of the inequality divide that has very much so become part of what's at the root of the divisiveness in America today is the fact that the shadow banking system is not regulated. The people who control the financial system, they get to do so as any cowboy would have in the Wild West. They're not regulated, they're not controlled, they're not supervised, they're not even seen. And if Jerome Powell, who does not need to be the head of the Fed, he does not need to be at the epicenter of criticism, whether it's from Biden or from Trump. They've both been very hard on him. Because he doesn't need to be there, then there has to be some other purpose, some other reason that he is at the Federal Reserve. And in my view, that is so that he can pursue the much loftier goal of reining in, regulating, supervising the non-banking system for the long-term good of the United States. Well, what's going on there at the root of your question is what the problem is. It's because something that is in the shadows by definition is not visible. So when I say that the non-banks of the world, whether you're adding up the aggregate of all of the private equity, hedge fund, public pensions, all of it together, the BlackRocks of the world, all of these entities added up on a global level come to $240 trillion in assets, which dwarfs the $180 trillion conventional banking system that is regulated. What can go wrong when something is of that magnitude is being contemplated? We have no idea. We don't know. We're absolutely clueless. And again, that's why people are always, somebody who watches this, and the very first YouTube comment might be, oh, that lady's full of it. How do they know? How do they know I'm full of it or not? Because they can't tell me what's in the shadows. Nobody can, because there's no international regulator of these entities either. And that's why some part of me knows that Jay Powell and all the other policy makers at the Federal Reserve, some of them probably know that they're committing the mother of all policy errors by by keeping higher for longer inside recession. Forget about headed into recession. We've already seen too many revisions to play semantics and play word games. We're in recession. So why is it that the Fed then wants to ignore that we're in recession, unless it's pretty important to press forward with regulations that bring out of the shadows the financial activities being undertaken inside the world of private capital? And that's kind of where we are. You probably did not mean to ask this question at all. But you got the answer. And the answer is we don't know what's going on in the shadows. We need to know what's going on in the shadows in order to protect what comes for the future, for future generations. And that's why I'm not some shill for the Federal Reserve. For God's sake, I wrote a book called Fed Up. But that is why I do hope that Jay Powell succeeds, because after the last round of regulations, Dodd-Frank and what have you, every banker who was like, I can't play by those rules, I won't make enough money, I'll just leave. I'll just leave the public sector and I'll just bleed into the private financial sector. And then I'll just keep making as much money as I want. That's exactly what happened. The biggest brain drain in the history of the United States. And now they're unregulated as they were before the crisis. Congratulations. Look, if you say retail investors, the whole reason that Roaring Kitty achieved cult-like status is because one person said, I'm going to stand up to some big hedge fund that I know is working in the background against smaller investors. Did he succeed? No. People lost their shirts. But on the other hand, we did see a big hedge fund go down. The question is, did the firms that were backing that hedge fund go down? Hell no, they're still with us. And they're still unregulated. That is correct. In fact, in January of 2008, the Wall Street Journal interviewed then chief economist at Goldman Sachs, Ed McKelvey, and asked the same question you just asked, identical. They said, hey, Ed, this is your rule. Your rules never failed and dated back to 1968. As of December 2007, the unemployment rate was 0.3 of a percentage point off of its lowest point in the last 12 months. Are we in recession? Now, listen, when you're Danielle, you can say whatever I want to. I worked on Wall Street. I worked at the Federal Reserve. I've dealt with compliance and sensitivity training and all that stuff. I can say what I want when I want. At the time, however, the chief economist at Ed McKelvey said, well, maybe the rule's not working right this time. In fact, it was. And 366 days after the recession started, the National Bureau of Economic Research backdated the recession to exactly December 2007 when it was triggered. So it has a perfect track record, unless it's different this time. Recession started in October of 2023. That's exactly what Bloomberg Economics came out and said just 2 weeks ago today. Well, I mean, but by the time we got around to call it, 7-8 months in to recession, the unemployment rate it still wasn't that high. It was rising. Of course, the unemployment rate is the third to last to get the message, right? It goes, the unemployment rate is the third to last, and then inflation gets the message, and the last one to get the message is the stock market. That's the last one to fall out of bed. So it usually goes in that order. But the beginnings of recession, 4, 5, 6, 7 months in, that's not the heat of it. It's a few more months from now that there's the possibility, oh, whoa, there was a credit event. Just last week in the markets, we all woke up on Friday morning, and by then, the equivalent of the S&P 500 in France was down about 9% from its highs, and the world started to say, "Ooh, that's a big enough move that it might affect." Oh, wait, U.S. corporate bonds. How'd that happen? So we got the first inkling of contagion in the air with what happened with the elections in Europe. But in the beginning, my 16-year-old right now is working a summer job in a warehouse. He's not going to lose his job. That's a good thing. So a lot of people are not aware that there's anything wrong with the economy until somebody they know loses their job. And it's typically when things are, when there's a heightened awareness on Main Street, that's when we tend to know things. And, what we picked up in the latest University of Michigan consumer sentiment read was the second fastest 3-month decline in income expectations on record. And let me tell you, University of Michigan data goes back into the 70s. So the only bigger move that we'd seen on a 3-month basis was in October 1990, when we were in the teeth of recession. So to your question, if June of 2024 is when people on Main Street, people in the real economy are like, whoa, I really think that a year from now, my inflation, my income, my paycheck's going to be smaller. We're kind of at the aha moment. And this is when things start to get really tricky, because rather than the people you don't know who've lost their jobs pulling back on their spending, now we see people who've lost their jobs and people who are worried they're going to lose their jobs pull back on spending. And that's when you get ripple effects into the US economy. So I think and I hope, and I applaud the potential for Jay Powell, who has recognized that zero interest rate policy didn't work. So I'm hoping that no matter how bad things get, that we don't have to go back there. And that is why the so-called dot plot that's released once a quarter by the Federal Reserve has the end of the road ending with, I think, 3.1% federal funds rate. So I like the idea that interest rates have gotten to be so high that we can even reduce them to the same extent that we've reduced them for the past few recessions and not have to go back to the zero bound. I hope that that's the case. I really do. But I think the message in longer term interest rates coming down as much as they have off their highs, I think that probably says to us that the risk is there, that the Fed's going to have to take more action, lower interest rates to a greater extent than what we would prefer. It's more like who you listen to, because no, inflation's come down a lot. So we're expecting that based on what happened with the consumer price index coupled with the producer price index, even the sell side economists who want to sell you something, even they're saying that they expect for the Fed's preferred measure, core PCE, to come in at 2.6%. I mean, who'd have thunk it when it's reported at the end of June? So, I mean, I think most people recognize that we're getting really close to the Fed's 2% target. The question is, do we get all the way to the 2% target and keep going? And people are like, God help us if that's the case, because then it's undeniable. You're in recession, or you're in crisis, or whatever it happens to be. And everything that we're seeing in terms of the sheer amount of apartment deliveries, the fact that most indicators suggest that home prices have begun to fall. These things are saying, gee, that biggest chunk of inflation is also going to come under pressure. So the question becomes one of, again, which you originally asked, what's the Fed going to do when inflation is clearly cascading towards its target? And I go back and say, I hope the answer is not the zero bound. Mm. And things are happening just the way they historically, traditionally have happened. So there's nothing that's taking place right now that's off script. It's always, gee, the Federal Reserve finally lowered interest rates. That's when the stock market finally, to use the absolutely correct verb, capitulates. And it's not usually until then. The fact that we're talking about the election happening at the same time as the first rate cut, now that gives me pause. So if I'm a retail investor, I'm asking myself some pretty hard questions. The first of which is, how much am I comfortable losing? And, if I'm in my 20s or I'm in my 30s and I'm in some 401k fund at work and I can ride this thing out, then ride it out. If you feel like you're a trader and you want to play the market and you don't want to be around for the last 5 or 10% upside and you want to hedge your position, then hedge your position. But you always have to look within and say, how much am I comfortable losing in order to make the very last of what I'm going to get? And again, this is not Danielle's opinion on the stock market. This is just what history typically dictates. We've lost 1.5 million jobs in the last 6 months. We have gained some part-time positions in their place, but not nearly as much. So we have to ask ourselves the difficult questions. Let's say I lose 30%. Typically, after the Fed lowers interest rates, historically, it's 32.9%. How comfortable am I losing 32.9% in the risky parts of my portfolio? And once you've answered that question, and you know that you're going to ride the stock market back up, as it historically has been the case, however long that happens to take, then you can sit on your allocation, or you can take some chips off the table. It's up to what your risk appetite is.